This is Topping's A90D headphone amplifier, and some people reckon it's the best headphone amplifier you can get. But is it really? Let's find out. A lot of people asked me to review Topping's original A90 amplifier, and honestly I wasn't particularly interested. Amplifiers that aim just to have low total harmonic distortion and great sine-ad numbers are pretty boring to me because the means of measuring those things aren't really related to music. But when the A90D came out, well, I was a little bit interested, and when APOS Audio offered to send me one, well, I agreed and I thought I'd give it a review as the owner was interested himself. So here it is. So what is the A90D? Well, to start with, the D part of A90D just stands for discrete. Now what does that mean? Well, headphone amplifiers use some kind of amplification circuit, and that amplification circuit often uses what are called op-amps. Now if you think back to the days of tubes, tube was an amplification device, and of course once the transistor came out, this replaced tubes with something that was considerably smaller. Now an amplification circuit will use a number of transistors to amplify the signal, and the design and topology of those circuits, well, there are only kind of really about half a dozen to a dozen common circuits. Now, many of these have been condensed even further with a whole amplification circuit put inside a chip, and that's called an op-amp. And these are very commonly used as they're readily available. The circuits for them are very easy to set up, but some manufacturers want to design something that's better than an op-amp based circuit and will design their own discrete component amplifier. That is, they will set up individual transistors and other components into some kind of circuit that suits their needs. And there are many different kinds of transistors out there from various manufacturers, and so they can customize things as they need for the kind of power output requirements they want, and depending on what they need the circuit to do. So very likely Topping wanted to have more control over the circuit they made with their own amplification circuit. So in that, one of the other major changes is that it went from the A90 uses switches for most of the controls, and the A90D uses an electronic circuit which is firmware upgradable for controlling all the features. And this allows a number of different features to be included, such as the ability to have it remember the volume level for each input, and other things we'll get into in a minute. But as far as amplifiers go, well, it's fairly straightforward. Let's start at the back as we usually do. Now, if you've seen amplifier reviews before, you know how amplifiers work. You probably won't need to watch this at all, but it has one unique feature which I've never seen on an amp before, and that's the ability to increase the number of connections that you can add to the amplifier itself. So for example, we have our normal inputs and outputs. They can be either single-ended or balanced. Now, in that, this can also act as a pre-amplifier, which you can switch in and out as required. However, if you want more than one input, Topping offers a separate box which you can connect here to this connector, and that will allow you to have more inputs. And that is one of the other features that having an electronic firmware allows, is the selection of the extra inputs when the box is connected and not when it's not. Now, since I talked about firmware upgrades, the firmware upgrade system of this is trivially easy. What you do, there's a USB-C socket here, you connect that up and a drive will appear on your computer. All you do is you drop the firmware file into that drive, and then the firmware will update itself automatically. And when it does so, it will add the name of a file saying that the firmware update succeeded, or add a file with an indicator that the firmware update failed. Incidentally, I upgraded the firmware when I got this, and it failed initially. So what I did is I downloaded the firmware that was currently on the A90D, reinstalled that, and then the update worked perfectly. But it's a good, simple system that doesn't require much intervention, and it worked perfectly well for me once I got over that initial firmware upgrade issue. But one of the things it did is it resolved an issue actually with the volume control I had, where sometimes the volume would jump up 20 steps or jump down 20 steps, and after the firmware upgrade that was resolved. So it's good to see that Topping are actively monitoring the issues with the A90D and are upgrading firmware promptly when required. But otherwise I've had no major issues with the A90D. One of the maybe negatives of having such a system is it does require using the remote control to operate it. So if you lose the remote control, well, you just have to buy a new one. So it can be a little bit confusing because it's a very similar remote control to other Topping gear. And well, you can select all the options through the controls here, including two unique things, which is two programmable modes. So if you set up the A90D, say for a particular situation, maybe say listening to a particular pair of headphones, you can press the C1 button, hold it down, and it will lock that programming into C1. Likewise C2, so you can set it up for two different setups. Maybe you want to have one preamp set up with a different volume level, or one for your headphones, or two different headphones with a greatly differing sensitivity, and you can set those up as required in those two programmable modes. But speaking of that, for outputs, we do have our usual collection of single-ended 6.3mm and our balanced Pentacon and 4-pin XLR. Now, the Topping A90D is a fully balanced amp, so that it is a balanced design from input to output. Now, that doesn't really matter. Now, balanced headphone designs have become something that was hyped up by one particular person many years ago, and it's become a little bit of an obsession with balanced designs, even though they're not technically necessary and do have some detrimental aspects to them. Now, in terms of using it, if you do have, say, a DAC or a source which is only single-ended, that's not a problem with the A90D. I had no trouble getting a good quality sound using the single-ended inputs and the balanced outputs, or using from the same device, say Fair Core QT2, using the balanced inputs and outputs. I found there was no loss of sound quality at all, which is something you can take for granted these days. However, on the output, the performance from the 6.3mm single-ended output was distinctly poorer than those from the balanced. If you are buying a balanced amp, I would not buy one if you're only going to use the single-ended output, as balanced amps tend to be designed specifically for best performance from the balanced outputs. So again, single-ended in, no problem, but you do want to be using the balanced outputs for your headphones. But as far as other visible features go, we have a display here with a few indicators for things like whether you're using preamp mode or not, or which input the RCA inputs or XLR inputs, or have the external box connected for extra inputs. Now that's the interesting thing, it does use soft power. So you do have a hard power switch here which can turn it on and off in the back, and then you do have a volume control here which it has soft power. So if you press it when it's off, it will actually switch on, and then long press it to turn the unit off, and then you can short press it while it's on to adjust some of the settings. But primarily, apart from the volume, you'll probably be operating mostly through the remote control, which allows you to flick through inputs, especially if you have the external box connected, and do most of the operations that way. But next, let's take a look at some of the technology of the discrete component amp inside, because there's some differences compared to some other amplifiers, which I think are very significant. I've opened up the A90D to take a look inside, because I actually shot the sound impressions before I did this, because there are a couple of tricky ribbon cables to remove which are going to require some fiddly work with tweezers to restore, and I didn't want to have to shoot the review with a non-functional unit. So anyhow, there's some interesting things in here which are well worth taking note of, and probably look inside, you see a lot of bits and pieces and don't know what they are. That's not unusual. So to start with, we have a couple of Meanwell power supplies. Now you can see actually even in the photos of the inside provided by Topping and on various sites, you can see that they're generic kind of $10, well about $12 Meanwell power supplies, and they are switching power supplies. So if you want to think about it, these are basically fancy wall warts in a box. So basically this is an amp using wall warts, which is why it's so small and why a lot of higher end amps are much larger, because it's easier of course to buy a $12 wall wart or a couple of them and stick them inside than make a good linear power supply, which also takes up more room, it makes more heat, and of course it makes the product more expensive, and this is why higher end amps are more expensive. Well, let's talk about power supplies because they're pretty significant. So if you think of a Class A power supply as well, it's like a Class A, well I should say a Class A de-amplifier, because it's often lowering the voltage from the wall power input. So that they of course run very hot. They're usually used in digital to analog converters, because the digital to analog converters, the power supplies only need to output a very small current. And what's more common is you see linear power supplies, which are sort of equivalent to a Class AB amp, or I should say de-amplifier, in that they use less power, but they still provide a kind of very steady current. Now these are switching power supplies, and switching power supplies, like your typical wall wart, use a high frequency oscillator, kind of like a Class D power amp in other words, and those high frequency oscillators can provide current on demand, which is of course how Class D amplifiers work. Now the negative part of the output of these switching power supplies, like your wall wart, is they often dump noise out. And so after the power supply, you require power filtering, and that's what you have here, these chokes here. I have little power filters, which I've mentioned in other reviews. One was a capacitor bank, which you plug into amplifiers to give it more capacitance, and all. Just like in here, you have capacitors along here to provide a kind of buffer for power for the amplification circuit. One of the ones I have is a filter for wall warts. Now, wall warts usually just let out the high frequency noise and leave it up to the component to filter out any high frequency noise that is unwanted. But you can buy these devices and they have chokes on them. And I noticed them when, say, plugging into the M17, you may have seen in my review, or something like the Cavalli Tube Hybrid or what have you, with some kind of amplification component, is that while the capacitor bank increases the dynamics because you're providing more of a power buffer, but the chokes, which are in the power filter, kind of rob the amplification of its dynamics. Now, I think that is something that you get an effect on in these cheaper headphone amplifiers, is that they kind of end up sounding somewhat flat. Now, the way around that I guess that Topping have implemented is to use a lot of power. So the power output is excessive. So that means it probably counters some of that flatness in the sound by just having so much power that you're not even going to get anywhere near the limits of the amplification. Now, that's just a theory. I'm not entirely sure. But the results of this, and comparing it to amps with linear power supplies inside, which obviously cost more, well, you'll see that in the sound impressions. But that seems to be what's going on inside these. And the same Meanwhile power supplies I used in the Singxer amp and in some of the others. Interestingly, some amps will have proper, at least small, proper transformers in there with some kind of a linear power supply, such as the Soncoz. Although it has a much lower power output, like in my impressions, you'll see it sounds a little bit cleaner. But inside here, so we've got this power filtering going on in here. Now we have all these little white boxes of relays. So this is a stepped relay attenuator or volume control. And we have relay switches for all the inputs and outputs. And we also have, I believe, relays that if you plug in a single-ended pair of headphones, that it will shut off the balanced outputs. And I guess that's what these relays are. Then we have the 4 discrete modules, and I couldn't take the caps off these to find out what's exactly under there. And I guess Topping doesn't want people pulling them apart and actually seeing what their circuit is and maybe where they got it from. And we just hope it is what they say it is. And we have some heat sinks on some transistors, which probably get very hot, obviously, because this is outputting up to, well, I think it was about 6 watts of power. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but, a fair amount. So that's basically what's going on in here. And, well, there's nothing really to fault that. And you have the control module for the electronics on the front as well, which is obviously connected here. And, well, really that's all as exciting as it gets. Now, what I'm curious to do, if I ever get around to it, would maybe, this is the bottom of the board where the power supplies are connected. This is obviously the outputs, where it outputs, going by the thing, I think it was 12 volts or something, 15 volts and 1.4 amps, is to get a linear power supply and just connect it up to these points and to see if it produces, see how the amp sounds with a linear power supply connected there. Would be curious to know. What I do wish is that Topping would have made a DC power input so you could connect your own linear power supply, or maybe their own. I think some other manufacturers have done that, where they offer a higher end power supply to use with their amplification if you don't want to use the inbuilt switching modules. So, and obviously that's going to make some kind of difference. But that explains why you can get an amp which is, $500 and has such high power output, is because they're using basically, $12 switching power supplies. So with that, what effect does that have on the sound? Well, let's get into that. Now, the idea that has been promoted by some people is that because if an amp has the lowest total harmonic distortion and the best synad numbers, that it will sound the best. But this just doesn't match reality, and that's something that was again proven by the A90D. And it's kind of not something I really want to have as, I don't want to focus that to be the focus of the review, but it's inevitable that because of the hype over this kind of amplifier, that it does end up kind of swaying the review towards discussing that rather than just kind of evaluating the amp on its own merits. Now, we've seen that the basic design differs from that of a high-end amp in that it only uses basic switching power supplies such as you'd find in a wall wart, or hopefully a little bit better quality than you'd find in a wall wart, as they can be pretty noisy. And So how does that end up translating into actual performance? Well, I evaluated the A90D not only with good quality headphones such as Dan Clark Audio's Expanse and Stealth and things like Hi-Fi Man Susvaras, with normal headphones, things that are not particularly hard to drive, even high-end headphones such as the Meze Elite or things like that, the performance was absolutely fine. Now, if you compare to something like basic shit audio gear at this kind of size, or the cheap topping amps, which around the $100 mark, the performance is going to be distinctly lacking, especially with headphones such as these. Even with regular headphones, you're going to find that the bass quality is going to drop off. But when you get into the $400, $500, up to $700 mark, such as with the shit audio's Jotunheim, and of course the A90D and things like these other amps, the Singxer SA1 and the Soncoz SGA1, we don't have those kinds of issues. However, there were some subtle differences. Now, my initial impressions were that the amp had very good headphone drive. It had very punchy sound. It was, well, I suppose, reasonably detailed as things go. I mean, in terms of general performance for a $500 amp, it was pretty excellent, and I had nothing really to say that was negative about it. Now, some people have observed with the A90 and maybe to some degree with the A90 Discreet that they tend to find them a little bit kind of cold and analytical and unpleasant. Now, I have a theory about that, and that's partly why I have the D90 here. Now, the D90, if you saw my review of that, while it was, excellent measuring it, it is kind of a very generic kind of by the data sheet digital to analog converter. It has a USB input, and that USB input was sensitive to computer noise. And that's not like you hear there's noise from the computer, so you hear noise on the output. What ends up happening is that electrical noise that comes through often through the ground plane from a computer, or basically a device that's connected to the wall, will interfere with the reproduction of the analog signal, and you end up kind of getting like a harshness or hardness to the sound. And I noticed in my review that if I plugged it into something with USB noise filtering, or for example, if I plugged it into a portable player which is not connected to the power, so the noise can't flow through the ground lines, that the sound quality improved noticeably. So I think it was basically that kind of combination that gave people the impression that maybe the A90 or maybe the A90D as well sounds a little bit kind of cold and maybe didn't make for a good listen. So what I did is I mainly ran the A90D out of higher end DACs. You can just see the shit Yggdrasil just out of view. Also have Chord's TT2. Now the TT2 and M scaler setup that I have, of course the TT2 has a direct headphone output, and it's not like a separate headphone amp. It's actually part of the output of the actual DAC itself. So it's rather different to what you get where you have a DAC and then an amp and then they have different circuits and whatever. It's very much more integrated setup. Now it is the most resolving gear I have here, and it's second only to the Chord Dave in terms of absolute resolution of things that you can hear. And I hooked it in via RCA to the A90D to try and hear, like I listened from the M scaler directly and then volume matched listen through the A90D through things like the Expanse to see how much I could hear that was similar and how much that was different. Now there was a distinct drop off in terms of absolute resolution, some of the finest details of the music, the instruments of the singers, that I could hear through the TT2 and M scaler that I couldn't hear through the A90D. And it's not really hugely unexpected. I mean, the TT2 is a $5,000 device. It's not because it's so expensive that I didn't notice the difference. Some people may accuse me of that, but no, it was distinctly that. There's simply the laws of physics. You cannot make something, using a couple of switching power supplies that is going to be as refined as something like the TT2 and M scaler. And you're thinking, but wait, the TT2 uses a switching power supply. Yes, it does, but it has supercapacitors inside, so you're not actually using the power from the switching power supply actually to drive the headphones. It's from the charged supercapacitors. It's a different beast altogether. But let's bring it down to something closer to what the A90D costs, such as the Singxer SA1, which is actually a couple of $100 more expensive. Now in this one, if you've seen my review, this has had the input capacitor bypass mod. Now to cut a long story short, the SA1 has some input capacitors which are designed probably to isolate it from poor equipment, dumping DC into the circuit and damaging your headphones or damaging the circuit. Now I bypassed those, which is something that's available if you open up the case and put a couple of little computer jumpers on. You can check my review for the details. So it has a little bit of an advantage in that I've kind of upgraded it in a in a slight sense. I don't expect to be plugging it into anything that is going to dump DC onto the output circuit and damage it. So in that, I found that the SA1 was maybe just a touch more refined than the A90D. It wasn't a huge thing, it was only a little bit. The A90D was kind of like this solid, punchy sound, whereas it was maybe just a touch more nuanced coming from the SA1. Now another one is the SGA1. Now the SGA1 has far less power than either of the other amps, and with most headphones that's not an issue, but with something like the Expanse and Stealth, I could find that I could actually get the amp up to the point that it was kind of ran out of power. But most of all, like at normal listening levels, without trying to push the amp into clipping, I found that the amp sounded a little bit more polite and a little bit more reserved, say, compared to the Topping, which is kind of more, punchy and kind of exciting. But still, if you're not a super loud listener, you could actually get away with this combination. But still, none of these amps did justice to the Expanse, in my opinion. I could still get much more detail and resolution out of my higher end system, and something that maybe some people who are super obsessed with low THD numbers would find insulting. I actually can get more detail and resolution out of my ALO Audio Studio 6, which is a large tube amp, and which has far higher measured distortion than any of these devices. And that's because distortion does not directly relate to the ability to either drive headphones nor resolve fine details in a music signal that is actively changing versus a static signal being a snapshot of which is being measured on an analyzer. So in that, but I mean, this is again something I don't really want to get into. We should be evaluating things on basically how they perform and not whether they have great measurements or whatever. Measurements which again are designed for the manufacturer to evaluate how something is performing, and not people online to declare things are better or worse than the others in a manner that does no relation to how we hear music, or at the most extremely little. So in that, as a $500 amp, actually I found it pretty excellent. Considering all the features that you do get and all the options that you do have, you have the choice of the A90, or something like the SGA1, where you have physical switches if you just want basic functionality. If it does appeal to you to have something, say, with multiple inputs, if you do get the extender box, or have all those, fixed volume or the programmable and savable settings, that kind of thing makes the A90D really good. And the only problem, that obviously concerns me is maybe all the effort put into doing that, is that going to detract slightly from the sound quality? Well, at $500, I can't say it really has. Now, recently I had an interesting thing, not an audio related thing so much, but I had an old network router die on me. Both the switching power supply for it died, and it took out the router as well. And that's my only concern with some of these amps. These amps and this gear all use, the same Meanwell switching power supplies in them. And are they going to last 10 years? Whereas something like, well, say, again, Headamps GSX Mini, it cost vastly more money, 3 times the money. But, well, in 10 years' time, I'm absolutely sure it's still going to be working. So do bear that in mind. Fancy electronics this may have, but we've still, occasionally been finding that this brand is, we've never ever in my life seen a head amp amplifier blow up someone's headphones. And I've never ever in my life seen a full-size audio GD component blow up someone's headphones. Topping, you see where I'm going in this. So there are some good and some bad aspects to it just to keep in mind when buying an amplifier like this. Run it for a little while on some cheaper headphones just to be sure. It's probably not a bad piece of advice, though I don't see this happening left, right and center every day, so I think it may just be a couple of one-offs or a couple of bad switching power supplies. So purely on its merits, I can recommend the Topping A90D. If the features match your needs, if that power output matches your needs, the value at $500 is really good. But again, it's not going to beat the high-end components, even stuff have way worse total harmonic distortion or way worse measurements. It's just simply the laws of physics. It just cannot do it. So I hope that review was helpful. Do you own an A90D? Please do consider sharing your impressions in the comments below so that people don't just get my opinion, they can see the opinion of actual customers as well. And if they're thinking of buying such a device, they can see the opinions of a variety of people first and get as much advice as possible. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.